Welcome to the second installment of the Operator's Dilemma, where we highlight the most impactful models and frameworks of the best companies in tech, told through the stories of the operators that built them. My name is Chris Bergner. I'm the head of finance and analytics at Equals, and I'm joined today by Eugene Lee, partner at Omers Ventures and previous head of business operations at Pinterest. Eugene's kind enough to join us today to talk through a two-part series that explains the global user forecast and global revenue forecast that his team built in his time at Pinterest. So first off, Eugene, thanks so much for joining us today. Excited for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Before we dive into the model itself, in this first part series, we're just going to cover the user model. I'd love to just get a quick background on some of your professional journey leading up to Pinterest and even what you're up to today.
Yeah, sure. So I moved to the Bay Area probably over 20 years ago now. Started my career off as a M&A banker. I did that for about 4 years, which seemed about 4 years too long. But went over from the banking side, wanted to get some operational experience, and went to Yahoo. And around the '05 time period when I like to say Yahoo was better than Google, but then it kind of quickly went into a tailspin shortly thereafter. I was part of the BizOps group there. Was working for a team under Yahoo Local, which was one of their properties there. Was there for a few years, learned a lot about BizOps and our thinking that I carried on to Pinterest, which we'll talk through in a second. I went actually back to business school for a few years, came out of business school knowing I wanted to do this startup thing. And it was a little bit early on. It wasn't as popular as it is today to join a startup. And was there a couple of different startups, had helped raise money. It was part of some founding teams. Sold two of those early stage startups, the last to Google before heading on to Pinterest. And my time at those two startups was really anything non-product in Eng. Was kind of the first business hire at those two startups. And then I, like I said, went to Pinterest to start their BizOps team. They didn't have a BizOps team when I joined, and then was there for a few years during the growth years, and then went to a different startup, wanting to get back into kind of the SaaS realm of things before moving on to my role here on the venture side at Omers.
Awesome. Thanks for that rundown. I feel like we have a lot of shared steps in common. I'm a fellow recovering investment banker and joined Equals as the 15th employee too on the essentially everything non-product side. So we got a lot in common there. I've talked to a few people recently too that as soon as they left Yahoo, that's when the decline started to happen. So I think there was a brain trust that just migrated around the same time, which is kind of
I want
funny.
to think so.
Yeah. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt there. So we're here to talk about the user model that your team put together. I think it's also helpful to kind of talk about what did Pinterest sort of look like at the time you had joined. Tell us a little bit about company size, what your team was sort of working on while you're sort of building this out.
Yeah, so I got there and Pinterest was probably around 250, 300-ish people, give or take. We There was a finance org, there's a sales ops org, there's obviously your normal product and monetization orgs, but they didn't have a true biz ops team. So I'll get into that in a second, but we were probably around 100 million MAUs, probably around 100 million in revenue at the time. Honestly, it was probably one of the funnest places I've been. There was such great energy. The company was scaling and growing. It was absolutely a great place to be, and I learned a ton. And we're in this kind of interesting phase of Pinterest's career where we hadn't quite figured everything out, but we had figured a lot out. I mean, you don't get to 100 million on both the user and revenue side without figuring anything out. But it was thinking through, like, how do we go from 100 to 200, 200 to 400? All these kind of scale metrics. And I think that was where kind of the importance of having a BizOps team there to kind of help think through some of those issues. and have that visibility for the go forward was crucial. So it was definitely an exciting time to be there when, crazy growth. Any company where you can join with crazy growth is a place to be for sure.
Yeah, and that was around 2015 in terms of the year that you joined. Is that right?
Yeah, it was like late 2015 when I landed there. Yeah.
Okay. It seems like the time that you're joining seems very relevant to what you were just saying around, hey, we're trying to think about escape velocity. How do we sort of move from what is like something that clearly has momentum to this true global social media powerhouse? I assume that's some of the thinking around having a formal biz ops team come together. But I also know that biz ops from one organization to another is not very well standardized. Can you help us think about what were some of the things under your remit as you were brought in? What were some of your priorities, both in the beginning and sort of through your time there?
Yeah. So I think just to again set the landscape. I mean, this was like hair on fire kind of startup growth, right? We went from, like I said, roughly 300 people to probably just over, in and around 1,000 people in a year and a half, right? And so it was a place where you
Wow.
needed some structure, but you didn't want too much structure where you're going to break the engine here, right? And so I think the BizOps team was hopefully there to provide some of that. So I've always characterized, kind of BizOps under what I call three pillars, right? And the first one is, you got to know your metrics and understanding the underlying drivers of the business. That allows you to do work on number two, which is kind of the sexy thing of strategy, and that can differ at many different companies. But how do we think about the go forward strategy and really the tactical strategy of the next, call it 18 to 24 months, and bring that back tactically of what do we have to do today. And then the third kind of pillar is BizOps is such a highly cross-functional role where you're working with product, sales, obviously finance, many different groups. And so how do you kind of bring in that alignment across those teams? So our remit at Pinterest was, again, how do we think strategically on a go forward basis about the product and the business? And then really that boiled down to our team owned the operating model for the entire company. So how do we think about user growth, and how do we think about revenue growth, and how do those marry uh, together? And then we would work on any special projects, from how do we enter new markets to how do we. I remember, I mean, a lot of people obviously know the Pinterest product, but it was predominantly female when we were there. And so how do we think about growing the male population, and what tactics do we need to do? So it was a wide range, but I think it was really at its core, it's understanding the business and how do we scale that business um, through these metrics that we're looking after.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And kind of makes sense that the story around internationalization and, building out the demographic to be sort of male, female, all represented all over the world, probably didn't want too much revenue concentration in any one place. And, if you think about like Facebook as the North Star, they've got what, like 1 or 2 billion users on the platform. So eventually it has to be everybody.
Yep.
So that's that kind of scale is funny to think about, but exciting that you had a chance to be able to work on that there. Thanks for the color on that. I think it would be helpful now with that background in mind to sort of chat through at a high level kind of how the model is structured. I know we have in the actual blog post a section to help explain some of the terminology as well too. I think that might be a good primer as we're rolling through this as well. So I'll hand the screen over to you if you want to give us a rundown of kind of structure, and I'll stop you along the way with a few questions.
Yeah, sounds great. Let me share my screen here. And I think you can see the model
Yes.
right now. Perfect. All right. So this was the base kind of user model. And so to give more context, we would actually have a weekly metrics meeting that would basically go through all these top line metrics that we'll discuss on this kind of summary page. But then, what are some of the underlying drivers of that metrics? And this was a weekly meeting among the execs and really the product team as well, because they owned a lot of these metrics. And this would help us forecast knowing what projects or product launches that they were coming down the pipe. So then that we could kind of adjust how we're thinking about, the next year or so in the forecast. So you can see here on this first page, this is just a summary page, and we'll get into more detail. But these are the key metrics: signups, MAUs, WOWs, WARs, pin seen, and then pin seen by site. And this was cut across, primarily the US, which is what we're focused on. And then ROW is just the rest of the world. And we simplified it a little bit in this model, but we actually broke out the countries that we were going after at a forecast levels, just so we can understand the dynamics of what was happening internationally.
Yeah, actually,
I
I
think,
think that's probably a good place to pause for just a little bit of reflection here. The things in some of our conversations that really stood out to me around this like geo split are, one is that the traffic sounded like it was highly correlated to things like holidays. The example I think we quote in the blog post is, hey, the 4th of July is Independence Day in the US, might not be the same holiday elsewhere. So kind of having this like localized map of that schedule is important. And then two, there's these more macro trends that are adopted on different time frames or social norms. Like at the time you were there, this shift to mobile was a big thing. Is there anything else worth kind of touching on as like things you were thinking about on the international split side and sort of building the drivers for each of those territories?
yeah, I mean, I think for us, it was trying to pinpoint the countries that we could have a specific strategy entering. Obviously, the natural countries after the US are the English speaking ones, and then most of the Western European countries as well. But we would split it out. I think we had maybe 13 or 14 countries, and then we would have the rest of the world kind of aggregated up. But yeah, like Chris, like you said, like you know, different holidays meant different spikes in months, for not just the U.S. but for other countries as well. And I remember specifically, I think Brazil, at the time, I think their desktop, the mobile was actually more prevalent. They had more prevalent mobile users at the time. So how do we cater the site to make it more mobile friendly versus desktop friendly? And then that obviously has a trickle down effect of where they go on the site, and then ultimately um, how we monetize the site. So we had to break it down at that granular level so we could forecast accurately, but then the product team would know what would they need to build or maneuver that would be differently on a site by site or country by country basis. And we can go through the metrics and just the quick definitions if it's uh, helpful, but some of them are relatively self-explanatory. But signups are just signups to the site. MAUs and WOWs are user metrics that measure how many people have come to the site. MAUs being monthly, WOWs being weekly, and it's monthly active users. Just to be clear, WARS was a unique one for us at Pinterest. It stands for weekly active repinners. And so what was really core to Pinterest at the time, I'm sure it still is really about product and how users engage on the product. And a repinner was when you would go to the Pinterest site and you would actually pin something to a board. There was a bunch of images, and you would actually pin something personally to a board. And that was our way of saying, if you were to be able to take that action, you would actually know what the value of Pinterest was. So it was a very big engagement and retention metric for us. And we would correlate that with users and signups and how we thought about the flow. But if we could get those users to this action, then we knew that we're off to a great race in terms of keeping these users on the platform for a really long time. If they were able to do that, then they would ultimately see what we call pin seen. These are pins and images on any of the Pinterest website, and then we would actually filter down to where they would go, which you can see here from board category, home, the home page, and whatnot. And so these were the top main metrics that we would again talk about during the weekly dashboard meetings, and then really forecast on how we think about the business.
Yeah. And
So
the sort of roundup, as I understood it, was you need to understand signups to know who your new folks are. MAUs and WOWs are sort of a combination of new plus retained users that are engaging on the platform. Your wars were actually a metric to help define some sort of activation as well too. And then that is sort of like the landscape of how you translate through to this like well-known, commonly cited external metric of monthly active user to the kind of atomic unit of content on the site, which was pin seen. And then can you touch on a little bit why the location or part of site was relevant to the sort of pin scene breakout and how that connects into the revenue model, which we'll get into in the part two?
yeah, so it was really important for us to break it down by all the different areas that you could surface areas that you could end up on Pinterest, because the monetization mechanics on each part of the site was different. So, for example, and we'll obviously get to a little bit more detail on this, but the homepage, as you can tell here, um, had the most number of pins seen. This is where most people would ultimately end up. You would scroll through your feed, but so a lot of traffic. You want a lot of eyeballs. Advertisers will pay for that traffic. But just like Google, in terms of like keywords and keyword search, a lot of these other pages like category, obviously search, and your board pages, they would all have topical keywords that would be built around them. So maybe Chris, you're remodeling a house, you're trying to redo your kitchen, and so you have a kitchen board, and so maybe you're saving, you know, different types of faucets, different cabinets, different decor that you want to save into your board, or you're searching for those items. Then we can relay that information back to advertisers. No, I'm making this up, but maybe a Home Depot or maybe a Lowe's that does
Mhm.
where you can buy these materials, and they might want to have their ads on those pages. So we can get down to a more granular level, and hopefully they get a better return on their ad spend from that
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, this some of this obviously unique to Pinterest's business model and how users engage on the platform, but I'm sure folks can kind of like translate that into their sort of own business models and monetization structure. I do just want to say, it's noted on the sheet here. Obviously, any of the figures that we're looking at are anonymized data. Some of the trends, I think, are probably still holding true for something like home being the largest, but none of this is actual historical data, but just meant to be representative for the structure of the model and thinking through the business itself.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then actually, the one thing I did want to touch back on wars, um, because this is a consumer business, um, and now I actually look at predominantly all enterprise software and SaaS businesses. This is something that we think about from a SaaS perspective too, as we look at companies. Is what are people doing in your product, right? And where's that? You've heard in the past, like, where's this aha moment? And that wars um, metric of repinning was that aha metric. And so we think about that a lot on the SaaS side of, like, how do you, if you can do a war, then you're an activated user. And that's kind of the same thing on the SaaS side, is like, if you're actively using one product or feature, then you've really got the hook of like, okay, I know it's maybe equals, it's like how many models you're creating, or something like that, right? And so you can kind of get a sense of retention from that perspective, even on the SaaS side.
Yeah, yeah, it makes we're totally relevant to our business too. So we've got this kind of like monthly breakdown here on this summary side that gives us sort of a clean view of all the metrics. But I know a lot of the actual like rigor and magic behind the model is actually on the cohort side. Maybe we just do a quick walkthrough of some of the metrics contained in there.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll take the US cohort as an example. And the model, you can see tabs here with the rest of world cohort. They were all built the exact same way. And so all the assumptions kind of flowed the same way here. So you can see all the different metrics. And so how we were doing it was first you think of it as a user coming in. And it's laid out with our kind of top level metrics, but signups were basically the core of what we were doing. And we would do that at a cohort basis. So I'll open this up and you can see um, all the different cohorts. We went back all the way, yeah, probably back to 2010. And so we had five, you know, when we were doing this, 5, 6 years worth of data cut by each sign up month that a user would come in. And so we would track this across every single month of your lifetime as a user up until we got to the forecast area. And for signups, we applied a year over year growth rate based on signups. And again, we mentioned this before, but maybe the October cohort here, you would have a higher growth rate in October because a lot of people would sign up for Pinterest because of Halloween. They wanted to see what Halloween costumes or decorations they wanted to do for their house. And so we had to adjust at the cohort level of on the monthly sign up level to adjust for that. So you might see a higher growth rate here, and then we would track it over time. And these are obviously static because you can't sign up more than once in a cohort.
Yeah, and
That would actually,
I think the thing that was really clever about how you guys did that is you're sort of able to apply that intra-year seasonality by doing those like 12-month lookbacks at prior periods. But sort of throughout, you created these kind of kill switches that said, hey, if we saw this anomalous trend where there was this giant spike, and I'd assume that especially be true for new markets where maybe you had like a really large volume increase that you might not expect in a future period, you could sort of overwrite that. But that's what allowed you to get to some of that like holiday schedule seasonality, right?
exactly. And then maybe we did a big marketing promo campaign in the US,
Sure.
or maybe it's Brazil. And so we could the year after that, we could adjust, certain metrics down and stuff. So it's a lot of cohorts that we could manually adjust. And that was the purpose of the granularity of this. And you'll see that more a little bit. Maybe we can go to the next metric for MAUs. And so MAUs was based off a retention of signups. So we started off with these global signups that come in every month. And we knew based off historical data how many MAUs would actually be retained on the platform over time. And so we would adjust that. We would look at that based on, again, these monthly fluctuations to see where we would have to maybe bring it up or bring it down. And so you would do it by cohort, and then you would obviously you would sum up all these, and you would have your ending. Sorry, there's a lot of cohorts, so I'm
Yeah.
scrolling up, but that would be your monthly MAUs for that year, for that month.
Yeah.
That makes
So it's
sense.
like the row view from left to right is what's telling us the actual like individual cohort amount and how that's retaining over time. And if I wanted
Yep,
to take the sum of total for any given month, that's the actual column set, which sums
yep,
all of the cohorted rows.
yep.
Yeah.
This number would sum up all the numbers,
Yeah. And this like
all the cohorts.
these active user metrics are sort of the like ARR equivalent on the software side of, hey, here's what sort of size looks like for us. Everyone was reporting these. You sort of needed a way to be able to understand what that metric might be, but then translating it to some of these other internal metrics that you're tracking really closely too.
Exactly. And MAUs was super important for us because this was like the gold standard of consumer companies. Every consumer company to date still reports out on some sort of user metric, and MAU is the gold standard. I
Yeah.
mean, and then you would want to look at the ratios between MAU and WAUs, and maybe daily active users, which we didn't actually forecast because it's a little too granular for the business that we were thinking about.
Sure. And was there anything, Eugene, to like here's a retention that we want to see, like, and I'm kind of thinking back to conversations that I've heard around some marketplace businesses like an Open Table or other B2C type platforms where it's like, hey, early on, you're going to get these early adopters that are pretty sticky. But when you get to like year 2 or 3, especially in a new market, you want your retention and engagement to look like X. Were there any of those kind of heuristics that you had in the back of your mind for those?
Yeah, so like when we were looking at these MAUs, or really any of these, any MAU, I would say MAU, WOWs, or WARs. So there are all these, monthly cohorts. What we were trying to look at was what does it look like going across, like, to the right of your sheet, and is that hopefully growing from that perspective? But then on a ratio basis, is is it also getting better going down? So for every sign up that we had, is the sign up per MAU actually getting better? So we would want both. And so at Pinterest's case, I remember like there was a 2014, maybe it was 2012 to 2014. Don't quote me on this, but there was a what we called the golden cohorts, and these were like our most active users because it was the early on users that really were like the passionate users on the platform, and that was exhibited through MAUs, WOWs, WARs, and pin scene, all our major metrics. And so we knew that they were highly engaged. So everything that we tried to do was how do we get some of these newer cohorts that were after that back to those engagement levels? Because if we would track across to the right, it was you could forecast that down to like it was a science at that point. It was so granular, and we knew those cohorts and how they would react. But how do you move your newer cohorts and try to re-engage your older cohorts to get to that point? So that was a lot of the product stuff that our teams were working on, and so we would track that in those ratios to see if our newer cohorts were at least exhibiting some of the engagement factors that we were seeing in those golden, what we called the golden cohort years.
Yeah. And so I imagine like the way you're doing that visually is you're sort of creating this cohorted view of an activation rate or MAU to sign up, as you mentioned. Was
Right.
there typically a period of like, hey, after 6 months or after 12 months, we tend to see that number sort of start to stabilize, or like what were some of those time increments that were particularly sensitive to the model?
Yeah, it was probably about the 6 to 12 month time where they would start to plateau. So, and that's natural, right? That's not
Sure.
specific
Yeah,
to,
of
to
course.
Pinterest but it's any business that you're trying to retain a user. It could be a SaaS business, marketplace, or consumer. But you'll kind of see this natural, like, sorry, I was doing the line the other way, but you'll see this kind of natural fall off and plateau. And so this was for us, this malretention kind of assumption. If we were to graph all these cohorted lines, you would hopefully see it become less steep, the line become less steep and plateau hopefully faster,
Hmm.
or maybe straight across. Maybe just if you're lucky, go straight across, right? Because it's 100% at that point. But that was why you can see here from the MAU retention percentage, and then there's a WOW percentage. Like this is again to the right and to the right and down is kind of what we're looking at. And then we would again, Chris, you mentioned like we could manually override this, knowing if we were from an assumption perspective, if we were going to launch something that we thought was um, going to affect some sort of change, or actually we would footnote it too, like so that when we would look at cohorts in the past, that we wouldn't make this, oh, we did something in 2014, a year later because this was a year over year model. We wouldn't want that see that same spike in 2015 or 2016. So we would have to go back and manually adjust the model that way.
Yeah. Yeah. That is getting into some of the next piece that I'm really interested to cover. And I think that's probably helpful enough for the model walkthrough. Appreciate you putting that on the screen for us.
Yeah.
But curious as you were getting to the kind of like last section in the talk track there around Here were some of like the check-ins or conversations that were powered by this model and allowed us to keep a finger on the pulse of the business. You mentioned weekly check-ins. Who are some of those folks with? How are you surfacing some of these insights? Would be great to know more.
Yeah. So underlying this model was a huge dashboard of, probably 30 or 40 metrics cut by, in some cases, the countries. And so every Monday we would talk about these metrics, would then indicate, um, the model. So we actually, this model we simplified a little bit for equals, but our model was actually a weekly forecast model. And so because we're having these weekly dashboard meetings, we could fine tune it on a weekly basis, then aggregate it up to the monthly, and then aggregate it up to an annual basis. And so by having these weekly check-ins, we could fine tune it. And then obviously part of what I mentioned at the start of kind of philosophy of BizOps, like it's alignment. And so it's a lot of talking to our heads of products. And we had a bunch in terms of like areas of focus on the site, talking to the person who led signups and activation, and just really getting, being partners to them and how are they thinking about, building product and how ultimately their user forecasts. And, everyone wants to, have some hypotheses around if they're going to launch something, what is that going to look like? We would hopefully try to bake some of that into the forecast and then help measure some of that stuff with them. And then the same thing on the ad side, which we'll get into, probably in the next call about how many ads should we show, what's the performance, and how does that ultimately affect revenue.
Yeah, that actually gets to a question I kind of had as I'm reflecting on what we've talked about so far. A lot of the reference points or touch points of this model to the teams outside of BizOps sounds like it's product. Is it correct that like when you think user model, you typically think of first partner to that being product, and then maybe it's on the monetization side that's like marketing and some other team?
Yeah, for us, it was for the user side, it was mainly, product, or, in some cases there's like a growth team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so some combination of those teams was probably the predominant consumer of the dashboard, our operating model, outside of finance and obviously the executive team. On the monetization side, the way that Pinterest was organized at the time was there was a user product team and then there was an ad product team. And so we would interact a bunch with the ad product team, and then obviously the sales organization and the marketing team, because they're out there, obviously selling the campaigns and for the site. So it was kind of both sides of the house that we were dealing with.
Yeah. So a little bit of everyone,
Yeah,
but
basically everyone almost. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Well,
That's why
that,
it's
and
such a
that's
great role. And I think it's a crucial role at companies. I'm obviously really biased about it, but it is a very cross-functional. And if you can build it hopefully right, it can be a very highly effective org.
yeah, yeah. That I think that really hits the nail on the head. You said up front the BizOps team, while some companies have it structured differently, it feels like almost everywhere they're an organization that can partner with and build relationships among folks all throughout the organization. It can be this great connective tissue for insight and action too, which clearly having something like this model in place could allow you to do. Maybe one closing question that, if you don't have an answer for is totally fine, but just curious how this model might be leveraged in some of the fundraising conversations that I'm sure were enabled off of some of what you were tracking here and the goals that you were kind of putting to use. I think in your time there, the company raised a pretty large funding round at like a $12.6 billion valuation right before the IPO. So curious how some of that informed the investor dialogue as well.
Yeah, I think this served as probably one of the bases for those conversations, along with kind of the traditional kind of FP&A and expense side of the model, because and as investors, now that I'm on the other side, we care about these top line metrics and where they're going to go to and the validity of those metrics, right? Are you actually going to get there? And what are the inputs and the drivers to ultimately get you there? And so, yeah, this served as the base of that. And then also, like, as you think about hopefully going public one day, you have to report on certain metrics to the street. And in our case, what were we going to report? And so we did a lot of work around. I remember, what are the other consumer businesses reporting on? How do they report? How do they talk about it? And then, ultimately, I think one of the numbers that we knew and that everyone was talking about that they ended up reporting on was mouse. And so how do you have, you're going to have to report to the street on a forecast of mouse, right? And like, what do you think the growth, from quarter to quarter is? And so we needed a model that could serve as a base for the forecast to report back to the street on like how we thought about user growth. And so that's why we had to go in deep detail at the cohort level from that era of time period of like, this is as granular as we can go to kind of build up from there. I'm sure they've gotten more sophisticated than we had with new software that's out there, but this was kind of the brute force way of us kind of doing it.
Yeah, I like what you said there. There's I think a bunch of things that other companies and sort of analyst operators can glean from, which is one, you weren't at the time of IPO, but you're sort of thinking ahead of, hey, if this business has real momentum, let's start thinking about what some of our peers are looking at in terms of North Star metrics. Let's have a strong perspective there. Sure, you're going to have some things that are unique to your business model. Something like the pin scene and wars was an obvious one, but don't reinvent the wheel on the like big ticket themes. And then two is like, how do you have a model or a framework that can sort of translate from those external metrics that investors and everyone else is going to be focused on to some of those internal North Star things that you're actually running the business off of. I think that from our time and sort of chatting through the model and getting a chance to play around with the template is what really jumps off the page to me as a huge success of the model here. And then being able to incorporate some of the localized trends around the geo and to like hearing about some of these golden age cohorts, being able to sort of think about how new users are retaining and behaving as compared to some of the early vintages. Bringing all those things together allows you to have just like a really strong understanding of business performance and momentum going forward.
Yeah, I think the goal was to try to have predictability, as much predictability as you could, and really understanding what those drivers are of the business, all the way from user growth all the way to how we make money.
Yeah, that was the like 3-line summary I was going for, but you did a much better job. So thank you. But
That's what I'm here
I
for.
think, yeah, I think that's we're sort of through the questions that I had. If there's any like parting advice or anything else that you'd want to pass on, would just pass the mic back to you for any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think as now that I'm on the other side of the table, so to speak, I mean, I think as companies hopefully use equals to kind of build their business and think about their businesses. I mean, I think it's an important thing that we look for is just, it's not maybe necessarily the actual numbers in the actual spreadsheet, but it's the line of thinking. It's how do you understand the business, or do you have some hypotheses on how you can affect the business going forward based on how models laid out, right? It's not like you're managing to the number to a degree, but it's like, okay, we know if we do A, it's going to affect B, and then ultimately maybe C, D, and E down the road. And how does that kind of train of thought input you? Because then the mastery. Hopefully, you get the mastery of your business, and then that will ultimately translate into the numbers at some point. It's a guide. It's a guide and a framework. That's all.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks so much again for taking the time, Eugene. Really cool to have a chance to share with the world some of the awesome work that your team built here. I know folks are going to get a ton of use out of this. If anyone wants to keep the conversation going, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can shoot me a message on Twitter. It's Eugene JY Lee. Or you can feel free to shoot me an email. It's EULEE at omersventures.com, and I'm sure it'll be on the blog post as well.
Yeah, we'll be sure to reference that out to the other channels that we have going. Thanks so much again, Eugene. We will be coming around with a part 2 on the revenue forecasts. So folks, keep an eye out for updates coming on that. And with that, I will wrap things up here. We'll chat again soon, Eugene. Thanks for the time.
All right, thanks for having me.